Hello, I'm Dr. Vaniea, and today I'll be presenting the paper Owning and Sharing Privacy Perceptions of Smart Speaker Users. A smart speaker, for those of you who might not have run into one, is a personal assistant that has a microphone, a speaker, and a connection to the internet. It's used as kind of an interaction point for voice commands. So the idea is that you'll give a voice command to the smart speaker, which will then carry out that action using a range of different connection points. Examples of what smart speakers can do include interacting with basic internet data. So you could ask it what the weather is or what an actor was in a movie. Interaction with Internet of Things devices. So you might be able to tell it to turn on the toaster or set an alarm. You could also ask it to turn on a light switch. Also, it can be used to initiate third-party services like Spotify. So you could ask it to play a song off of Spotify. And it can also be the speaker or microphone for another device. So you could use your phone, for example, via Amazon to have a conversation with someone. Smart speakers are designed to be, vocal, right? The intention is that you'll be able to speak to them and then they're able to speak back via the speaker component. That means hands-free. Their selling point is that they can interact, again, vocally. So you can put them in a big space like the living room I have pictured here and just say things like, Amazon, Alexa, turn on the TV. That's very convenient, so you can understand why users would like them and why they're effective. The problem is, though, that because they're almost most useful in these big open spaces like living rooms, kitchens, shared office spaces, they also are readily accessible by people who don't necessarily own the device. So these are places that often have visitors that come into them, that have different groups that might be coming through that aren't necessarily a part of the home or part of that office. And these visitors don't go through the same processes that an owner would in terms of setting up the device, in terms of understanding how they function. And so in this work, what we're most interested in understanding is how much owners and visitors differ in terms of their understanding of how these devices function, the privacy concerns around the devices, and their ability to understand how the way the device functions impacts privacy or what their control options are. So in short, if someone is an owner of a device, if they use it regularly, do they have a better understanding of these issues than a visitor, someone who's only interacted with the device a couple times? So in order to answer these questions, we used an interview. We interviewed 19 participants using a combination of standard interview questions and also some drawing and free listing activities around the scenarios. Participants skewed younger with an average of 26 years old and tended to be students and young professionals. This is useful for us because many of these people were in shared living situations, which means that their encounters with smart speakers tended to be in places like living rooms and components like that. We also attempted to get people from a range of ownership versions. The survey structure focused on prior interactions with smart speakers. We tried to go a bit more in depth with a recent interaction. We gave them 3 different scenarios involving a built-in skill, a third-party interaction with Spotify, and something that is visibly in-home, so in this case, turning on a light bulb. And we talked about the comfort and acceptance with smart speakers in shared spaces. Perhaps the most interesting initial problem you see with smart speakers, even realizing that it exists. So visitors and residential owners, so owners that exist within the space or maybe live within the home but don't legally own the device, we're often surprised to discover that there even was a smart speaker present. We had several participants talk about how they came home and suddenly realized that there was a smart speaker on the mantle that no one had even asked them about. And they were like, okay, where did this come from? And it would start a discussion of like, this was added here and why. For visitors, this is even more true because they might come into a space and not even realize for several hours or at all that there's a smart speaker present and potentially listening to many of the conversations they're having in that space. And so discovery was a major problem. And obviously linked to discovery is also consent. Because if they don't realize this device is existing, then there's no way for them to be aware of how it's being used. The other thing we discovered is that the concept of ownership has a very different meaning technologically and socially. So an owner of a device, so someone who considers themselves to be an owner, might be somebody who lives within the home, regularly uses that space, but doesn't necessarily have access to the account associated with the device. So most of these devices are tied to a singular account, and that account has control of a lot of the settings, and then more importantly, it has access to all the logs and records. So every single time someone interacts with a smart speaker, that interaction is recorded and logged. So the audio, for example, exists within a recording, and it can't necessarily be changed. And so that there's kind of a distinction, because there's a bunch of people that really felt that they owned these devices but had no access to the accounts behind them. That problem is also kind of inverted as well for people who do have account ownership, because the smart speaker has no authentication associated with it. It will communicate with anybody who happens to be present, and it will give them the ability to perform many actions associated with an account. So, for example, they can play whatever song they like, but they also could, say, search for something online that might be something the device owner is not comfortable with, but will now show up against that person's search record. They could try to purchase something, for example, and the device would simply allow this to occur because it's set up to do that. You might also think that, okay, well, yeah, that's all true, but someone has to actually be inside my home, or at least be somewhere within vocal range of the device for that to happen. And we had a funny example that came up with our participants, where someone had purchased a Google Home but hadn't told anybody about it. And then another person in the home had attempted to play a scary movie over their Chromebook and had auto-connected to the Google Home. This caused a scary movie audio to play out in someone else's bedroom, which really confused both parties until they sorted it out. So this concept of privacy is not just about the logs and the recordings. It's also around kind of access to spaces where these devices have no authentication, and so they allow really easy connection, both in terms of using the device, but also in terms of sending content to the device. We also found that owners and visitors had a surprisingly similar understanding of the connections to cloud services. So when you're looking at things like asking for the weather or the Spotify scenario, in both cases, people really did understand that something was being sent out across to the internet, and that internet connection might be logged in some way, mostly because there was an explicit party involved. So like for weather, they're like, well, maybe it's contacting BBC Weather. The light bulb scenario, and this is similar to what prior work has found, that connection was very unclear. We saw a lot of users really explain how this was going to be an entirely in-home event, that Google was going to turn on the light. You tell it to do that. It tells the control frame for the lights, and the light turns on, as evidenced by this drawing. That is inaccurate. If you look at how these functions in reality, smart speakers almost always have to involve an external server, at least the Google or the Amazon or the other provider's server, in order to go and actually process the audio data. So they almost always have to do a call out, even for an in-home event. And then if you involve something like a light bulb, which is probably managed by a third party, like say Philips, then the voice comes up, it has to be processed. That processed data is sent over to Philips. Philips then sends a signal back into the home telling the light bulb to turn on. And this cycle was very not evident to people, and it was definitely not evident not only to visitors, but actually owners were not aware of this either. Finally, the concerns and protective approaches were also quite similar between owners and visitors. So people were concerned about information being uploaded, about their voice being recorded. I mean, all of the sorts of concerns you hear commonly. But also, similarly, they had very little understanding of protection options. When asked, almost none of them had read privacy policies. They had no sense of what the different controls were even available to them via their smart speaker. And most of them would just mention, like, if I really wanted this thing, if I was concerned about it, I would unplug it. So in conclusion, existence of smart speakers can be surprising. Smart speakers only have one account, but they have many users, and that's compounded by the concept of ownership, in which people may feel like they have some control over the device, but they actually don't. And we find actually the owners and visitors have very similar understandings and attitudes around smart speakers. Thank you very much for watching this presentation.